Greetings, everyone. My name is Rashid Darden, and I'm a member of the Beta Lambda chapter of Gamma Xi Phi, the professional fraternity for artists. Beta Lambda chapter serves the southern United States from Virginia to Florida, all the way over to Mississippi. We bring you programs of a virtual and in-person nature to serve arts, the arts-serving professionals, museums, the youth, the elderly, anyone who is in favor of the arts and wants to see the arts lead this nation. In that vein, we have today Mr. Byron L. Williams. Today, we're going to hear from Mr. Byron L. Williams, who is an experienced trainer, teacher, educator, nonprofit leader, and government leader, and he has used hip hop to inform his practice as an educator, both at home during this pandemic and abroad in Ukraine and Lesotho, where he was a Peace Corps volunteer. He's also been a staff member for Peace Corps and has worked with numerous nonprofit and governmental agencies. Mr. Williams, we're so lucky to have you speaking to us and through us to all of the educators out there of all kinds who might want to spice up their pedagogy a little bit, whether at home or in the classroom. So, Mr. Williams, please show us and teach us everything you know about infusing hip hop into our classrooms.
Thank you very much, Mr. Darden, and thank you very much to Gamma Xi Phi for having me here, specifically to the Beta Lambda chapter for inviting me to talk a little bit about my experience with hip hop in education. And so what we have today here is I would call it a brief presentation, but I think it's packed with a couple of nuggets that you might be able to enjoy and use in your classrooms, in your environments, wherever you may be teaching, well, not necessarily teaching hip hop, but learning to incorporate hip hop into your classroom lessons or into your sessions, wherever they may be. So, Mr. Darden, would you mind if I shared my screen with you?
Sure thing.
So with here, we have the pedagogy of reinvention. And like I was saying before, that a big part of the reason that Mr. Darden has invited me is to talk about my experience of how I have incorporated hip hop, not only into my lesson plans and into my curriculum when it comes to teaching in the formal classroom environment, but also how I've incorporated hip hop into my everyday job as a trainer and as a training and development specialist throughout my career. So with that, I think the first thing that I have always considered is my audience. So I have always looked at, if my audience who I'm teaching to is going to be, to younger people, if it's going to be to people who are very experienced and know a lot about hip hop, even if the topic that I am presenting on might not necessarily be hip hop. But for today's presentation, for today's workshop, with you, this can be used for educators at any level. So whether it's an educator in a formal classroom environment or in an educational institution, I would say you can also incorporate this into any type of job where you might be teaching, where you might be instructing, where you might be helping someone to learn their job or to teach them how to do their job, or just informing a classroom, whether it be on history, whether it be on social science, whether it be on hard science, whether it be on art, music, whatever the case may be. So today's presentation, today's workshop, is for all audiences. So we have three short objectives for today. And this is something that I always keep in mind when I'm building my presentations, when I'm building my curriculum, when I'm building my lessons for any audience. And that's one is connecting whatever I'm teaching to hip hop. And I think this for me is just kind of a personal favorite, because I know hip hop permeates life for me. So, throughout various stages in my life, whether I have worked for a nonprofit, whether I've worked for a school in the United States, whether I have worked for extracurricular programs, whether I worked for teaching Spanish, I've always figured out different ways to connect what I'm teaching to hip hop in relevant ways. The second objective is to understand how the culture of hip hop is more than the stereotype. a lot of the times when I'm incorporating and building hip hop into my lessons, I also know that people, in particular people who may not be familiar with hip hop, only see hip hop as a monolith. You know, the first picture that I had up when we started our workshop today is a picture of Eric B. and Rakim. So to the untrained eye, or to somebody who might not be familiar with hip hop, they see what that stereotype is of, you know, a black man or a black person with money and with jewelry as a flashy symbol of their achievements. But if you know Eric B. and Rakim, what they stood for, what they rapped about, what they mean to the culture is a lot more than what that picture was. That just happened to be the cover of one of their most famous albums. But at any time you're building out or more so incorporating hip hop into your lesson, you always want to understand how the culture of hip hop is more important, is more than just a stereotype, and making sure you're building that in. And then the third objective for today is whenever you are incorporating or building in, is to always incorporate something historical and connecting that to something relevant to the current times. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go on. So for today, you know, when I look at building out, you know, I'm always, you know, have at least these kind of 4 materials with me, and it's always whatever material that I'm using. For today, this is just an example of what I would use as kind of a material sheet for a lesson. But you know, one of my favorite recent podcasts that's to do with hip hop is Louder Than a Riot through NPR. So like, for example, if I was building a lesson for today, presenting a lesson for today, I would have my resource or my material because Louder Than a Riot is a podcast. I would already have it queued up for the specific segment that I would be using for my environment. So I would have my material as far as my source or resource. You know, that could be a podcast, that can be a tweet, that can be a text from a book, that can be an actual song, it can be anything. But definitely having whatever your source is ready. So that way, it's already, you know, whether it's queued up or ready for whatever you're going to be going into next. And if, you know, my material is, if my lesson is going to be a workshop or a presentation, usually I would like to keep it to 3 slides max. So that way it allows time for, that way we're not focusing on necessarily the presentation, but more so the material that comes with it. So, you know, your introduction, your conversation around the material, you know, some type of activity, and then whatever the homework may be at the end. And, you know, I would also have sometimes a note card per student, so that way the student can take notes and take that with them. You know, of course, they can also use a notebook, but you know, depending on the exercise, like for this exercise that I've done before, I would have 1 note card per student, and then of course a writing utensil such as a pencil.
Okay. So
when building out, I think one of the things that has always stuck with me, and that's because I've been in a lot of workshops and presentations about hip hop. Some have been good, some have been the complete opposite of good. The first tip that I can give is do not pander. One of the things that I detest hearing is someone pandering to the audience. So like when you see those, you know, one of the things that comes to mind is when you see those TV shows and they have the person who is supposed to be possibly espousing some type of or holding to some hip hop demeanor is the yo, 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 what's up, da, 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 all that stuff. In presenting a workshop, I feel pandering really helps you to lose credibility with your audience.
Right, it cheapens the experience.
Oh, completely. And I think, you know, you go from people being interested to then people being like, you know, who's this joker? You know, how much time until this is over? Things like that. So understand that hip hop, and like I had said earlier, It is more than the stereotype. So, of course, going into what hip hop is, it is some of those things, when you're talking about obviously the elements of hip hop, DJing, breakdancing, graffiti, emceeing. It's all of those, but it's also, the nuances of culture, such as fashion, such as the social justice elements, such as the coded language, such as the history, such as the foundation of what it is, such as the transformation of hip hop throughout the times, all of those things. So Not Pandering really helps you to be able to reach your audience in a credible and responsible way. The second thing is,
if I could ask a clarifying question, would you also phrase that as be authentically you?
Ah, well said. Yes, definitely be authentic.
Gotcha.
And it's something thinking about myself where, I know my audiences. So, I also know my age. So, the slang, the language that I use from when I was, knee deep into hip hop is not the same slang I'm going to be using today. So, I know, like, for example, one of the newer terms right now is like no cap. That's not in my vocabulary, but I know what it is and I know how to use it properly. But the language from when I was, at the kind of the peak of hip hop, I mean, of me being like, really dissecting the art, that's the language that really stays with me and that I use as a part of kind of my everyday language appropriately. So, even within hip hop, my authenticity is based on where kind of I really of the age of how I really identify with hip hop, the era. So, I think just in being authentic is also realizing kind of where you sit within the culture. And that doesn't necessarily mean you have to be, all throughout and knee deep in everything, but people can pick out when you are not being your authentic self, but definitely being courageous. So there are going to be times when you have to stretch yourself, whether it be, sometimes using language, sometimes knowing different artists who may not be your favorite artists or you might not identify with, but still knowing, possibly their background and being able to connect their background to whatever you are teaching on. The third one, and that leads us into that, is figuring out ways to connect, even if it makes you look out of touch. I had a great conversation with a youngster here in DC, and we were just talking about, kind of our top 5 hip hop artists. And I was naming hip hop artists that, were that are some of my favorites. People like Little Brother from North Carolina, Eric B. and Rakim from New York City, Lyrics Born from the Bay Area. And so in talking about those people, the people who I was working with in this particular workshop, they were all high schoolers. So you're talking about probably a 20 year age difference. But in connecting with them, it was a lot of, oh no, you're wrong, and there's no way that you're right, and have you listened to this part of this song? And even though neither one of us had really a lot of experience with one another's top 5 lists, I said, you know what? If I give you a couple of songs to listen to, will you also give me a couple of songs from folks that you're really interested in to listen to? And that really helped us to connect, not only during that lesson, but also afterwards, where we were talking about the material that I was presenting on that didn't necessarily have to do with hip hop, but it also gave me an in to talk about what the lesson was on, and to talk about hip hop with this high schooler.
So you'd almost say you sort of reinvented yourself as an educator while teaching the subjects and infusing hip hop.
Yes, and I think it's very important. Anytime you're teaching, is never to shut down your audience. Your audience. I mean, because obviously you're trying to reach your audience. So in trying to figure out ways to bridge those gaps, whether it's some type of teaching gap, or whether it's an age gap, or whether it is an experience gap, is always just trying to find that bridge. And, you know, I know for me, I have had to kind of push myself to listen to different artists because, you know, I would consider myself always a student of hip hop. And that also means that I'm listening to people who I might not agree with, who I might not like, who I might not see value in. But that does not mean that the people that I'm, you know, working with or teaching to or learning with don't also see the value. So I am valuing people, artists that they value, as well as I hope the same when I also either make recommendations, you know, based on who I'm into or what I'm reading or whatever issue that I am hoping to educate people or my audience on. And I would say the fourth tip is to know that your students are intelligent. I have been, and I say this for any age range of, you know, I say students in a loose way, meaning your audience, whoever you are teaching to, instructing to, learning from, learning with, is knowing that your students are intelligent. I think in particular, when it comes to hip hop, because of many times who our audiences tend to be, or who we think our audiences tend to be, a lot of times, you know, looking at black and brown youth, is that, you know, they may be knowledgeable in hip hop, but or that's as far as their intelligence goes. And I think it's very important to never underestimate the intelligence of your students. And I say this because I have been in situations where, one, I've seen a presenter automatically assume that their audience only knows hip hop and does not know anything else, and they end up leaving with egg on their face. And because I am also want to be transparent, I have also done the same, where I have assumed my students did not know anything beyond hip hop. There was one time where I was teaching about trade, and I used an example in hip hop about bartering, in relation to the lesson that I was teaching on about trade between countries and trade throughout histories. And as I was talking about trade and trying to make the connection, one of my students ended up talking about Silk Road, from the road that was built through China. We were talking about like spices and cloth and dyes and such. And in that moment, I realized that I had made an assumption about my students. At that time, I think they were probably 10th or 11th grade, but I made the assumption that my students only understood trade, barter, in the sense of talking about hip hop, but not in the sense of talking about history. So I had to quickly correct myself, and in a roundabout way, I apologized, but I also learned that I have to make sure that I am seeing the intelligence in my students. Just like when I was younger, I wanted the presenter to see my intelligence beyond hip hop, but how hip hop is a part of our everyday lives.
And it's a good reminder for teachers out there to, you know, always inject a prior knowledge check into your lessons, because not only could it save time, it could, you know, like you said, save the embarrassment as well.
Yes, and it can, I mean, you know, teaching is not only about sharing information, but it's also about building rapport and relationships. And I think, you know, looking at what you do, Mr. Darden, you have an amazing rapport with your students, with your audiences, and I know you've worked at that. You know, that's one of your gifts. And I think for all of us, as we're working with our audiences, it's always figuring out a way to not only to bridge a gap, but also to build relationships. And I think with hip hop, this has been a great it's been a great experience for me, because it has helped me to build so many relationships with people who many times are not seen for the whole people that they are.
Well, Mr. Williams, I'd also throw in there that when you are teaching through the lens of something that you love, students can't help but pay attention.
Yes.
And for me, as someone who was inspired by folks like Dr. Marcia Chatelain and the Ferguson syllabus, When I was, early in my career in alternative schools, I have this affinity for David Bowie. And I really, at the time of David Bowie's passing, wanted to find a way to use David Bowie's life and body of work as a method for teaching various things, whether it's vocabulary, whether it's social issues, whether it's American history through the eyes of someone who was not American. And honestly, on one hand, yeah, you're kind of proselytizing for David Bowie as much as you might be a proselyte for hip hop. But there's also that moment where people are like, wow, Mr. Darden really cares about this, or Mr. Williams really cares about this. Let me lean in. Let me see what he's talking about. Let me see what he's hitting on. And I think that any teachers, whether it's, at home teachers or otherwise who are listening to this, it's okay to teach through the lens of your own passion, because it's not the subject that the students fall in love with. It's the way that you deliver it, because they will learn something, they will learn something inevitably.
And that energy that you give off when you're teaching about something that you are passionate about definitely translates into your students, and that really helps them to, and just like you were saying, Mr. Darden, is, all of a sudden they're like, oh, well, Mr. Darden or Mr. Williams is really into this. Let me see what's going on here. Like, why are they interested? And then that helps that gives them an on-ramp into also the material that you've prepared. I think it's also great to see that a lot of times, depending on how we teach, how we instruct, it's also our audiences seeing how we are connected to the material, because that helps them to also connect to the material. Yes.
Okay.
And this is how I get to it when I talk about hip hop and things. So I have to remember that everybody has the energy that I have, but I have to sometimes take it down, sometimes take it up. But yeah, I love hip hop, as you can see.
Are there any more tips, Mr. Williams?
No, that is it for that one. And so that takes us into, building a lesson. So, I'm looking at a lot of the environments that I've been in. Usually I have like probably an hour time frame. So I'm looking at, maybe 5 minutes to start a session with something that will grab their attention. So what I have liked to do, because the audiences that I have kind of been teaching for have been people who are either very familiar with hip hop or know nothing at all. So kind of like two extremes. So, when looking at something that grabs somebody's attention, like I've had where, like, for example, in the corporate environment, I've had workshops where as people are coming in, I have a little boombox set up with possibly something appropriate for that environment playing already in the background. So that way it's not people coming into a cold environment, they're coming in, and even though they may not know it, they're already starting to digest something that is in line with the lesson or the workshop that I have prepared. So start with something that grabs people's attention, whether it be maybe a speech in the background from somebody. I think of one of the things is there was a monologue from Goody Mob's who was it? What song was it? Fighting, on their self-titled album with CeeLo was the one who had a monologue. So I've put on pieces of his monologue. I've put in Eric B. and Rakim, an instrumental in the background, or things like that. So definitely start with something that grabs their attention, so that way as your session begins, then you can reference whatever it was as people were coming into the environment of, hey, did anybody happen to pay attention or listen or know what was happening or hearing what was happening beforehand? And then that also helps you to go into like the next 5 minutes of establishing a baseline for your curriculum or for your lesson. I think more so for your lesson. So, from going from that, kind of hitting them with the shocker, something that gets them to tune into what, you're going to be teaching on, is then to establish, where do people sit within that lesson? Are they beginners? Are they intermediate? Are they experts? Do they have, some type of knowledge about the artist, some type of knowledge about the text? And possibly just asking, hey, X, Y, and Z class, are you familiar with the material that you heard as you're coming into the classroom? Or are you familiar with the text that I have on the screen that you saw as you were walking in? So just to see where people are at, whether it be an informal poll or survey, or maybe a quick discussion, or something to see where people are at. And then from there, I think this is where you're going to really get into the meat of your workshop, is that facilitated discussion, which I would say probably around 20 minutes, and then providing instructions to instructions around an activity, so 10 minutes. So you're looking at that 30 minutes is really going to be what captivates your audience, what helps your audience to see how the two are connected. One of the things that I feel right now, so like for me, for example, one of the lessons that I taught was on language acquisition. So I used a fill in the blank for a song that I was teaching that had to do with relationships and romance and the evolution of a relationship. So for that 20 minutes, I facilitated a discussion around dating, and what I had done too before we started, I had provided a vocabulary for us to kind of incorporate, to talk about, to be aware of. But in that discussion, even though the topic was on language acquisition, at that time we were talking about dating, relationships, romance, the relationship of the artist, the connection of the artist to that song, and what the classroom's experience had been with music within their relationships. And that really helped us to move into the activity, which was writing their own love song. I think it was like maybe 2 or 3 bars of a love song. So that really helped with my objectives for that lesson, was using the vocabulary, which was like 10 or 15 words. It was being able to write. So it was seeing how well they had been learning how to write in English during the time that we had been together. And it was also being able to give or to spit a couple of bars and to get them comfortable with using their newly acquired language. So they felt comfortable enough with all of us doing the same thing to hit on the lesson objectives, but I use hip hop to meet those objectives. And then the last 5 minutes of like this hour class would be reviewing your objectives to make sure that they're met, and letting your class know what you'll be covering next period, if there is a next period or a next session. So that way they can go home thinking about what you all just covered, what you just presented, and then how what they just learned or what they just put into practice, how we'll connect to whatever the next step is, whether it be a lesson, whether it be a competency, whether it be a topic within the class, whether it be a maybe a work issue, just figuring out a way for all of it to connect.
So one of the things for those teachers who are on block scheduling and might be doing 90 minutes instead of 45, where you want to build that time up, is the establishing the baseline. For those of you who are familiar with restorative practices, you might want to do an academic circle, and that would be how you establish the baseline, and that would be easily 15 minutes instead of 5. You might want to incorporate an exit slip. You might want to workshop or do centers for the younger students. I mean, and centers work even for adult students. But there are ways to make this shorter, and there's ways to make this longer. Your mileage may vary.
Yeah, and thank you for the math there. Yeah, 45 minutes. But yeah, it always depends on what your audience is. How deep you want to get into it, what issues also you may be addressing. Because sometimes, looking at what maybe 20 minutes or 10 minutes, you may have to spend a little bit more time discussing before going into the activity, especially if you see that there are issues that need to be addressed. I know I've done that plenty of times where I've had to adjust kind of my time or my time allotments for kind of each section to make sure that I'm not glossing over anything, but also to make sure that my audience knows that I value where they are on their journey in relation to the topic that I'm teaching and how it connects to hip hop.
Okay, and that brings us back to the beginning.
It
right?
does.
Okay.
Just like a record.
Perfect. Well, I'm going to stop sharing and I want to extend the conversation just a little bit more while I have you. So when we're talking about hip hop, we're talking about not just the music, but the culture, as you said earlier. And there are two things I wanted to talk about before I let you go today. And the first thing was, how do you, I know that your individual tastes are pretty varied, but I've now moved to rural North Carolina where hip hop sort of looks and feels different. And it's more regionalized, I would say. And if I were to teach through the hip hop lens, I believe that I'd have to really incorporate an entirely different bench of artists, if you will, a different roster of artists. So how do you account for regional differences when you are infusing hip hop into your work?
That's a great question. So I know from when I really got into hip hop, because I'm from Las Vegas. So for us, it was the heavy influence of West Coast hip hop, particularly at the time it was gangster rap. But because of the way that I just took it all in so quickly and so much, I also became a fan of hip hop from across the United States. So, definitely East Coast, definitely West Coast. But then as I started to explore, I was also looking at the time, the South was like on the rise. So, when a lot of times you think about Outkast, like coming out like around that time and just how they put the South on the map. But I think when it comes to looking at regions, it's really looking at, and I've had to do research to figure out, okay, as I'm presenting, like who's in the audience, where are they from, who are big chunks of my audience, is making sure that I'm typically I start with regional artists, and a lot of times that's just like research. Maybe it's going on Apple Music, maybe it's looking at maybe one or two or three artists from that region, and when jackets were really popular, like CD and tape jackets, going through their catalog to see like who they collabed with, who are some of their influences, who are some of the people who are in those liner notes, to who they credit with their success. And when I have done presentations and workshops on kind of like that involve regional artists, using the regional artists as an on-ramp. One of the movies that examples that really comes to mind is Hustle and Flow. So when you look at the fact that was Tennessee, the director, I think he was Craig Brewer, he was a student, and I mean like he did his research. So when he was going around trying to figure out how to get this project off, not only was he looking at incorporating, who was it, DJ as the main character, but he had a dialect coach for DJ, and then he was really trying to figure out how to talk to artists and get them into the movie. So when you look at people like Project Pat, when you look at Trey Six Mafia, when you look at who I'm trying to remember who else was in, Stax Record. So even going back outside of hip hop, when you look at the influences of hip hop for that movie, for that region, you're looking at the funk and the soul of Stax Record. People like Isaac Hayes and the influence that they had on artists out of Tennessee. And so I think it's incumbent upon the person presenting, when you're talking about regional influences, and that on-ramp is using the artists, the history, the magic from that area, because that also lets the audience know that you've done your homework. You're not just coming in being like, I just did a quick Google search and I found 8 Ball and MJG, and that's the only thing I'm going to use for my presentation. You're digging in, and even though you may not use it, it's also knowing that you know that in case somebody wants to dig a little bit deeper, you can go there with them. And then that credibility allows you to then, you know, whether it be comparing other regions or other artists, but it gives you the ability to then springboard into other areas, other regions, other artists, other sounds, and other parts of history.
Right. I mean, it goes back to that credibility piece. And I mean, authenticity goes hand in hand with credibility. So
Yeah.
my last question on that note is, I mean, it's interesting that you bring up hustle and flow because, you know, what I remember from that is whoop that trick and it's hard out here for a pimp.
Yeah.
So in today's environment where we are more enlightened by we are more enlightened by people who have been victims of the homophobia in hip hop, the misogyny in hip hop, and those issues are not exclusive to hip hop by any means. But you know, there's a reason. It's by design that most women are not in our top 5. That there are, you know, to date, no mainstream successful openly gay rappers. Yeah. So how do you reconcile that part of the culture with infusing it into your pedagogy?
Thank you. Great question. I feel that it is always important to recognize the, you know, as influential as hip hop is, it's also to recognize the flaws within it and not skirt it. You know, I think about, you know, one of my favorite artists, you know, for the longest has been Jay-Z. I tell people I would never want to meet Jay-Z. That's because I know some of his background. Well, you know, a lot of us know some of his background with him being a drug dealer, with him having, I think was shot his cousin. But it's also been certain parts of his music, such as like, what is it? It's not Big Pimp. I think it is Big Pimpin'. Well, one of his songs where he talks about the way that he treats women, the way that he raps about them. Say it again.
Yeah, that's it.
Okay.
Yeah.
And
I love the lyric, but I hate the lyric.
Yes, and he talks about. Well, you know, I'm not going to go into the lyric, but I know for what the lyric is and what it took to build that lyric and the cadence and the rhyme scheme and everything. You know, bar none, one of the best. But as for what, you know, parts of that song represent, like you were saying, the misogyny in it, for what, you know, a part of his catalog represents the homophobia. It's also knowing that just like people, we are all flawed. We all have the things that are good about us and the things that are not so good about us, things that we need to work on. You know, I think hip hop does have a lot of growing to do. I think we consider, you know, kind of the not baseline, but a lot of what the foundation of hip hop was. Of course, it was born out of the pain and suffering and the creativity, I should say, of Black and brown people. It's also understanding that with it being, you know, definitely a heavily male-dominated field, it comes with that braggadocio, with that machismo, and I think it's just now as a culture we're coming to terms with, you know, we don't have to be, you know, the hardened man to identify with our audience. You know, when it comes to you know, some of the lyrics that talk about homophobia. I'm not going to say talk about homophobia. Some of the lyrics that are homophobic is addressing those lyrics from where we are now to where we were. You know, who was it? Kweli, I remember in a song he had used you know, I'm sure a number of times, but he had used a slur. And I remember watching an interview where he had said, you know, with some of the language that he used back then, he now understands why it was bad for him to do that. And he was just thinking of a way to, you know, get across to a certain audience, a way to, you know, to rhyme, or a way to complete that lyric. But as time has progressed, he's also seen, you know, how that lyric may have harmed people that were listening to his music. The same with Jay-Z. Like, you know, I remember it was and I don't know if this was before he was with Beyonce, but he talked about how, you know, he would never share his money with a woman. And, you know, he said, you know, for me to have said that lyric when I was in my early 30s, that was so short-sighted and so irresponsible of me, knowing that I had so many people listening to me and following me, and admitting that as a successful entrepreneur, a husband and a father, that lyric he said, you know, 10, 15 years ago, now he's like, I feel so bad that I said that I did that was my mentality then, but that was also who I was around. That was what I was learning. That was what I was picking up. That was also what I was espousing. So I think, you know, coming back to your question is how, you know, in reconciling the homophobia and the misogyny, and, you know, I also feel the misogynoir within hip hop is, you know, for me as an educator, is also letting folks know that there are parts of hip hop that I love, and there are parts of hip hop that I don't, but here's why I don't. So that way it's not just, oh, hip hop is this great vehicle, this amazing creative expression, which it is, but it also has flaws that really have caused damage, has done damage, and has a responsibility to address where we are, what we can do better, where the art is, and places where the art needs to change. I think that's very important, because I would never, you know, even for myself, music that I listened to in my teens and in my early 20s, I know I can't identify with that. I know that I can't listen to it like I used to, because of the growth that I have with learning more about, you know, culture, with learning more about how to treat women better, with learning more about my LGBTQ brothers and sisters. Like, I would never want to say those things or do those things or think those things that can cause harm or damage to people who I consider close, for the simple fact of not wanting to change and wanting to hold on to something that I felt was impactful for me at certain development points in my life.
Well, I think that is a powerful note to sort of wrap things up on. I mean, you know, this whole point was to talk about the pedagogy of hip hop as the pedagogy of reinvention. And I think that you have summed it up nicely in terms of where some of our favorite artists were and where they sort of ended up. And I want to close it out by asking you, Mr. Williams, if people have follow-up questions or could use some paid advice from you, how can they find you on social media? How can they reach you?
Yeah, so my Twitter is at Byron L. Williams, and my LinkedIn also Byron L. Williams. I think right now I check LinkedIn and Twitter fairly often. So those are probably the two best vehicles where you can reach me. Or, you know, because you and I, Mr. Darden, are great friends, if people would like to also reach out to you to get to me, I'm okay with that as well.
And you can find me at president@gammaxiphi.com by email. You can always send Gamma Xi Phi a private message on your social media platform. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for hearing Mr. Byron L. Williams and his wonderful presentation. Mr. Williams, thank you so much for joining us. We have been edified. We have been improved by having heard your words today. If you'd like more wonderful programming from Gamma Xi Phi, please follow us on Instagram, Facebook. We are also on LinkedIn. And if you're interested in joining up with Gamma Xi Phi as a member of one of our chapters, just send us a message at executivedirector@gammaziphi.com or slide into those DMs. Until next time, I've been Rashid Darden with the Beta Lambda chapter in the South Atlantic region. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time.